My name is Peter Ashton. I am the co-chair of the Regional School District Study Committee, and I will be presenting a brief presentation discussing the work of the committee to date, and also the warrant article that will be presented at both the Acton Town Meeting and the Boxborough Town Meeting this coming spring. As I talk about the presentation, I will cover first the charge of the committee as well as its membership. Then I will turn to the various issues that we have identified and broken the work of the committee into various categories. These include governance issues, educational impacts, administrative impacts, financial analysis and the preliminary results from that analysis. And then finally, I will discuss briefly the draft warrant article that will be presented, as I said, at both town meetings. The membership of this committee, and it was formed by the Acton-Boxborough Regional School Committee last fall. The membership includes Mac Reed and myself, Peter Ashton, as co-chairs, one from Boxborough, one from Acton. The other two Acton representatives are Juan Kong, who serves on the Acton Public School Committee as well as the Regional School Committee, and also Adria Cohen, who also lives in Acton. The two other Boxborough representatives are Mary Brolin, who serves on the Boxborough School Committee, the local school committee, and then also Kristen Hilberg, a former selectman and finance committee member from Boxborough. The charge of the committee essentially was to consider and analyze the viability of expanding the current regional district, which serves grades 7 through 12, to include grades pre-kindergarten through 12. So in other words, to incorporate potentially into the region the elementary schools, the 5 elementary schools in Acton, as well as the 1 elementary school, Blanchard, in Boxborough. In addition, the committee was asked to research and evaluate any other possible amendments that might be made to the current regional agreement, whether we were to decide to go forward with full regionalization or not. This is a mandate, a 5-year look back every 5 years that's contained in the current regional agreement. As part of our work, we have sought input from stakeholders from both communities, including parents, educators, administrators, and others who have an interest in this issue. Before I get talking about some of the particular issues involved, I think it's important to just briefly highlight some of the demographic trends and enrollment trends in both Acton and Boxborough at the elementary level. If you look at this chart, basically we are today right about in the middle, in 2011-2012. And you'll see that enrollment in Boxborough, which is denoted by the green line, has been dropping over the last 10 years or so at the elementary level. In Acton, enrollment has just begun to drop and is projected to continue to decline fairly precipitously over the next 8 to 10 years, falling by about another 375 students. Combined, which is what is shown in the blue line, even over the next 10 years, enrollment is projected to continue to decline and then only begin to move upward slightly at the end of the projection period, 2022 and 2023. This decline in enrollment provides an opportunity to consider whether, in fact, combining at a regional level makes sense for both Acton and for Boxborough. Let me turn now to some of the different issues that we have been considering. The committee basically, at the very early stages of its work, as I mentioned before, broke up its work into a number of different issues. Governance issues, which deal basically with the regional agreement itself and what it might look like if we were to regionalize pre-K through 12. Educational impacts, administrative impacts, and financial impacts. Turning to the governance issues, we've raised a number of different questions with regard to what the agreement might look like, how it might change. We have reached, I guess, what I would characterize as tentative agreement on some of these, but many of these are still unanswered at this point and will be sorted out if and when we continue our work after the town meetings this spring. Some of those issues relating to governance include the budgets themselves and how the assessments will be both calculated and then, more importantly, allocated between the two towns, Acton and Boxborough. Currently, that's done on a 3-year rolling average in terms of the operating budget based on enrollment. Whether that's something that would continue or not, obviously is something still to be investigated. In addition, how transportation costs might be allocated. One may point to the fact that perhaps Boxborough may have higher transportation costs than Acton, or vice versa, and how that might affect the allocation of costs between the two communities. And then also how to treat current debt. That relates really to a second issue, which is the buy-in. Obviously, right now, the elementary school buildings are really under the control of the two towns themselves, not the region, which is a separate legal entity. So a question has been raised, obviously, whether the region would own the elementary school buildings. If so, whether they would be required to make any kind of buy-in payment, and then also whether they would assume the current debt that exists both on Blanchard and Boxborough, as well as the elementary schools, particularly the Parker Damon building in Acton. That leads also to a question, well, maybe the region would not own those facilities, but perhaps might instead lease the facilities. Another issue to be considered. And then also another issue related to governance is construction and renovation costs. If in the future significant capital costs were to be incurred, how those again also would be allocated under a new regional agreement. As most people are aware, currently under the existing regional agreement, there is a 5% discount, if you will, for residents in Boxborough. Since under the current region there are no schools in Boxborough, Boxborough has historically, since about 1997, had a 5% discount on construction costs, so they pay 5% less than their pro rata share, and Acton pays 5% more. That obviously might be something that would be changed or removed with there being schools now also in Boxborough as well as in Acton. But still issues that remain to be considered and worked out. Also, there is the location of students. The committee feels fairly strongly that if you live in Acton, for example, you should be guaranteed a spot at one of the Acton schools, and vice versa for people who live in Boxborough. In addition, special education and extracurricular programs, some guarantee again in terms of location of which particular school you might opt for. Parent options also in terms of equal access in Acton, choice, that program we would consider would continue for sure. And then also, as we mentioned earlier, transportation responsibility and transportation costs. Finally, there is also the treatment going forward under regionalization of community ed. Both Acton and Boxborough have separate community ed programs. We would think, but again have not made a firm decision on this, that we would integrate the Boxborough community ed programs into the Acton community ed programs. Let me now talk a little bit about some of the community input that we have received and also some of the analysis that we've done in talking with folks about potential educational impacts of regionalization. In doing this work, we have interviewed school administrators, teachers, union representatives. We've had a number of meetings with the various PTOs in both Acton and Boxborough to receive feedback and input on what potential educational impacts might be. We've also looked at and studied some of the other regionalized districts to get a better understanding for those particular educational impacts. Some of the perceived benefits of regionalization that we have been told and had feedback on relate to shared curriculum efforts between the two towns, which will enable us to reach more students and serve our student population better. There will be enhanced professional development opportunities for teachers in a combined system, more collaboration, which I think is a very good idea. Greater efficiency and better services for special education in both towns, less administrative hassles as far as that goes, and more focus on delivering services for special needs students. In addition, other perceived benefits of regionalization include greater efficiency in terms of obtaining resources, things like supplies, textbooks, that type of thing. Expanded collaboration with both administrative and instructional personnel. Increased flexibility and the ability to maintain and enhance various educational programs. Greater ability to place students in the best programs between the various schools. Increased options. You're basically moving, if you're in Acton, from 5 schools to 6, so you increase the options. Obviously, if you're in Boxborough, you move from 1 option to 6 options, so expanded options for all students and families. The committee has had fairly lengthy discussions about this, and we see that there will be significant efficiencies that can allow the maintenance and sustainability of our excellent school programs and school systems to continue even in the face of continued economic pressures and stress going forward in the future. There have been expressed to us some perceived concerns also with regard to regionalization, and we think it's important to identify these as well. These are not necessarily those of the committee members, but concerns that we have heard in talking with folks out in the public. This includes potential impacts on individual school identities. Each of the 6 elementary schools have their own individual identities. Some people are concerned that that might be lost. We certainly don't believe that that will occur. There is certainly no anticipated change in sort of the makeup or the educational philosophies of any of the schools, that will in fact be maintained even with full regionalization. Others have expressed some concern about children having to spend longer time traveling longer distances on bus from school to home and home to school. Again, we don't see this as a terribly significant concern, but are certainly aware of that. Some people have expressed concerns about possible changes in Boxborough to their well-established and excellent music, chorus, and band programs. But again, as I mentioned previously, we certainly don't anticipate any such changes going forward. There could be possible changes in class sizes as well as number of specialists. Some concern has been expressed there. Certainly in the work that we have done, particularly projecting forward, we do not see any changes in terms of either teachers, specialists, or assistants. And frankly, we see greater flexibility in terms of dealing with different class size issues, particularly being able to reduce class sizes in some of the Acton elementary schools. And then some have raised issues with regard to whether there would be any implications for teacher contractual changes going forward. This is again an issue that we continue to study and analyze, but do not see major issues at this point in time. Turning now to the administrative structure, full regionalization will simplify the current structure, current organization, and governance. If you think about it, currently we have 3 different school districts with 3 different school committees. Obviously there's some overlap, but you have 3 different organizations operating the schools that would be merged ultimately into one system. Those 3 districts have distinct student record, human resource, and financial record keeping and management systems. They also engage in duplicative regulatory reporting efforts primarily to the state. With full regionalization, that would be eliminated. You would have simply one school district doing all of those functions, reducing duplication and operating in a more cost-effective manner. It would streamline operations, it would make the organization more efficient. That in turn would lead, we believe, to more coherent learning experiences for the students, where more focus can be placed on education as opposed to administration. There would be more transparent financial reporting with a single entity. There would be more consistent benefit management for employees. And there would be a simplified intergovernmental relationship whereas currently there is more back and forth between the municipal side of the governments in both Acton and Boxborough and the schools. That would be simplified. And then finally, there is a belief that there would be improved interaction by parents and guardians with the school system as you have a more streamlined, efficient operation. In terms of our work in analyzing the administrative structure, the committee has met with both superintendents in the two towns to review the current structures. We interviewed department heads at the district level and examined the impact on the elementary schools at each building level in terms of potential impacts of regionalization. We then reviewed the results of those interviews with the superintendents to receive further feedback. The committee then met and brainstormed to understand what a new organizational structure from an administrative perspective would look like under full regionalization. And then we also did look at other regional school districts and how they were organized to ensure that what we were looking at made sense relative to what other regions have done. In working on that analysis, we came up with a series of potential savings with full regional organization, again, strictly at the administrative level. We have assumed no change in the teaching or teaching assistants in any of the elementary schools. So these impacts and these cost savings that we're talking about are strictly at the administrative level. There would be savings in terms of eliminating superintendent time and other administrative services as shown on this slide. Ultimately, we're talking about savings of about 2 full-time equivalent employees, perhaps more. And right now, the dollar value that we're placing on those savings is somewhere in the range of $100,000 to $150,000 a year. Let me now turn to the financial analysis and preliminary results that the committee has developed thus far. The methodology that we employed in this analysis was essentially to set up 2 different cases. What's called a base case, which is essentially the status quo going forward, which would mean no regionalization at the elementary level and simply looking at budgets and revenues over a projection period of 5 years under an assumed status quo. We compare that base case to the full regionalization case, the second case, which does look at the change in the organization from an administrative standpoint under full regionalization pre-K through 12 and what those impacts might be from a financial standpoint. Obviously, the difference between those two reflects potential benefits or potential savings. We did this projection over a 5-year period beginning with the fiscal year 13 budgets and revenue information that we have that will be in fact voted on at town meetings this year, and that is in fact the starting point for our comparative analysis, although we did look at both last year and the year before's budgets and revenues as a basis for comparison. The base case follows the budgets and the anticipated revenue amounts for education at both the elementary level and also at the region, because in point of fact we need to calculate essentially a total cost of education pre-K through grade 12, both for Acton and then for Boxborough, to then compare that to the full regionalization case. In the full regionalization case, we make several changes in the financial model. First, as I mentioned before, in terms of the changed administrative structure, we have identified savings from up to $150,000 per year. In addition, we identified transportation revenues that we will get from the state that we would not otherwise get if we were not regionalized at the local level. The state reimburses a portion of all transportation costs for regions, but not for local school systems. Based on models put together by the schools, we estimate a savings of about $520,000 or thereabouts, savings in terms of additional reimbursement that we would get from the state in the form of transportation revenue. We also identified savings in both Acton and Boxborough municipal budgets of certain administrative costs of about $60,000 a year. We projected that there would be a decline in Boxborough of choice revenue. So on the flip side, they have choice students coming into Boxborough currently, which would gradually over a 7-year period, we assume, be phased out. That is a loss of revenue of approximately $25,000 per year, increasing over time. Finally, we projected that there would be a shift in certain costs that would have to move from the school's budgets to the municipal budgets as required by law. Those would be existing retirees' costs, but that really has no bearing or impact overall on the financial analysis. Most importantly, we projected no change in the current academic environment, no changes in teachers or assistants or specialists. Our preliminary results have identified cost savings and additional revenue of approximately $695,000 per year in the full regionalization case relative to the base case. We think of these as benefits because only some of them are actually cost savings, others are enhanced revenues. However, with the shift in enrollment increasing towards Acton, in other words, a greater number of Acton students will be a portion of the total enrollment, rising to about 84% versus the current region, which has about 82% Acton students. This has an impact on the overall results in terms of how the assessment or the costs would be split between Acton and Boxborough. If one were to apply the current regionalization agreement, or current regional agreement, it would actually lead to slightly higher costs in Acton, but very significant savings in Boxborough. Recognizing that this could be an issue, particularly for those in Acton, the committee has agreed that we would need to ensure that both communities would participate in the savings, and therefore some adjustment in the regional agreement would be necessary in order to ensure that both Acton and Boxborough would enjoy and participate in that $700,000 total benefit, or approximately, that I mentioned earlier. And that would in fact be part of the work of the committee going forward to ensure that that in fact would occur. So what will be brought forward at town meeting in both Acton in April and Boxborough in May is simply what we call a sense of town meeting article. And what that means is we are simply looking for the vote of town meeting to see if they believe that this is a concept that is worth taking forward to draft an actual revised regional agreement between Acton and Boxborough that would include grades pre-kindergarten all the way through 12. And that regional agreement, or draft regional agreement, would be developed in time for then a vote at the 2013 annual town meeting, in other words, 1 year from now. And that is essentially what the Sense of Town Meeting warrant article asks. The Regional School District Study Committee has voted to recommend approval of this particular article, as we believe it is worth pursuing and continuing our work to try to devise a revised regional agreement between the two towns to include the elementary schools. This is an important distinction, that this particular article is not saying that we would have an agreement and an approval of that agreement, but merely saying that our work would continue into the future. And town meeting in both towns next year would then have the opportunity to actually approve a revised regional agreement and approve the going forward with full regionalization. That is not something that we are asking for at this year's town meeting. We are simply asking to move forward with the work that we have begun last fall. That is the report of the Regional Study Committee at this point, and we hope to see people at town meeting, and we hope that you will join with us in supporting this article. Thank you.